Okay. Hey, everyone. I'm Ramona Hattendorf. I am the Director of Public Policy and Civic Engagement at the ARC of King County. Rachel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Nemhauser, the Director of Information and Family Support. Thanks for being here.
Yeah. So Rachel and I got involved in something called, we're still figuring out if we wanted to do it, but we liked the aim. It was something called the Inclusionary Practices Technical Assistance Network. They go by IPTN for short. So this class and this are on the ongoing series of classes the Arc of King County is hosting this spring is part of the IPN Technical Assistance Network offerings for 2025. And we're doing it through something called the Family Engagement Collaborative. So at the ARC, we promote and protect the rights of people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities, and we work really hard to build inclusive communities. So we felt this was a really strong tie-in for us. The IPTN is a statewide collaboration, and it is administered by the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. Some of you know them as OSPI, and they help oversee the schools in the state. Another key partner is West Ed, and then there's education partners across Washington State. The Family Engagement Collaborative is one of those partners, and we are part of the Family Engagement Collaborative, which also includes PAVE, Roots of Inclusion, and Education Northwest. And so the goal is to help educators learn a little bit more about disability and the way to support families, and to help families learn a little bit more about inclusive learning and ways to navigate the special education process. And so I am done, and now I will hand it over to our host for the evening, Zach.
One of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Ramona, I just got a email from Jonathan saying the link we sent doesn't work. It says he needs to be a host and he needs to sign in
That's
order.
what I'll send him a different one. Hang on.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, yeah. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name's Zach Sadiq. I work at the ARC of King County as the Disability Systems Navigation Coordinator. And one of my favorite things to do is to talk to people about all matters disability related. I'm also autistic. I'm a social worker and a community organizer, and just a strong believer in making sure the voices and perspectives of people with disabilities can be included in all matters, places, settings, yada, 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 etc., that have an impact on our lives. And so, very glad to be here talking about all that today. So I'm going to hit a couple of magic buttons and hope that y'all are able to see the PowerPoint I'm sharing. Can y'all see it? I okay, I'm now seeing yes, thumbs up and good. I'm assuming that means you can. Great. Yeah, so just a little about me. I grew up in Western Colorado, was probably like one of the first people ever like diagnosed with being autistic in my school district. They actually had to fly out a psychiatrist, I think, from Denver like 3 or 4 times to do the ADOS. Always just interesting to think about like how much, like now with telehealth, probably wouldn't have to do that anymore. So it's kind of cool. Growing up, it was always kind of difficult for me to relate with other folks. I always just sort of like felt, felt isolated from, my peers, the teachers I was working with. And
Yeah.
like the message I always got was like, since I'm so like quote unquote high functioning, and I hate that term for like all the reasons. Like my autism wouldn't hold me back. Like I'd be able to do whatever I wanted to do. And I believe that like right up until I was fired from my first 2 jobs after college. And then that sort of radicalized me to become a social worker and pushed me to get my social work degree from UW back in 2018. I did my practicum at the ARC, and I've just been at the ARC pretty much straight from, I want to say like 2020, 2021. I don't know, time's relative at this point. I also run a series of meetup and social support groups for autistic folks, autistic adults called the Square Pegs. We've got about 22, 23 groups happening a month. And it's just a good way for me to just, hear what autistic people are going through, just get my finger on the pulse of the issues that are impacting us and learn lots of cool, other things as well. So I'll be talking about things from my own personal experience, the experience of other autistic people I know, and also like what I see, written, by other autistic people and what I see reflected in the research literature as well. And I'm also very lucky I'm not here alone. Jonathan is here to present with me as well. So Jonathan, who are you and what are you doing here?
It is possible Jonathan can't hear you. He texted me that he is having trouble hearing things.
Oh, okay. And I'm
Let me
assuming it's tech related. Okay.
Maybe we should come back to Jonathan's. Oh, can you hear us, Jonathan?
Oh, okay. Can you all hear me now?
We can hear you. Can you hear
We
us?
can.
I can. Yeah. Sorry. Bunch of technical stuff. I just got a
It
new
actually
laptop.
worked out perfectly. Like you
Yeah.
slid in just as it was your time.
All right. Let me see now if I can maybe get my headphones. But yeah, I will introduce myself. I got a new laptop. That's something about me. And so none of my logins, and I don't have Zoom Workplace, which is the difference. And so that's why I was figuring it out. Um, but my name is Jonathan Martin. I'm a high school social studies teacher for Everett Public Schools. I was at Jackson High School for a while, and now I'm substituting. A little bit about how I ended up, helping out working with ARC. I was diagnosed ADHD as 26, self-realized autistic at 29, so ADHD. And I'll talk a little bit about self-realization or soft diagnoses a little later in the presentation. I've done a lot of work for nonprofits, a lot of work around men's accountability and primary prevention around gender-based violence. And that's all transferred a lot into me being trying to step into more of a disability rights advocate role. And I bring all this into my classroom as a teacher too. So from a autistic person's lens, and I'm happy to help with anybody that has students in their family or are teachers, educators themselves. So that's a little bit about me. And thank you all for your patience while I figured out all the Zoom stuff.
No worries. It's always funny how tech issues pop up like at the like the most worst time. And so
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm there. I totally get it. Yeah, so today we're just going to talk a lot about like, yeah, what actually is autism and other forms of similar neurodivergencies. How does it impact us? How do we define it? How does it impact how our brain forms and how does it, sort of impact the different needs we might have as neurodivergent or autistic people? We're going to then talk about things like intersectionality, how to create better, more supportive spaces for neurodivergent folks. And knowing Jonathan and I, we're probably going to talk about a lot of other things that aren't necessarily on this list as well. And connected to that, we just want this to be as engaging and as interactive as process as this can be. So please let us know if you've got questions. Type it in chat or raise your hand using the reaction tab, and we'll definitely want to get through questions as they come through, so we can try and make this more interactive. I also know y'all have probably sat through your fair share of 90-minute lectures. We're not going to try and have this be one of those. So, stand up, stretch, get a drink of water, do whatever you need to do. Jonathan and I probably won't be too offended that you choose to do that. And also, please let us know if there's anything we can do to make this presentation more accessible for you. All right, awesome. So it might be useful to just take a quick pause and learn who's in the room. So if y'all want to take a chance to type in chat, name, your pronoun if you want, the role, or, like how you're connected to autism or neurodiversity, what you're looking to learn, and, if there's anything we can do to make this presentation more accessible. So I will get a quick drink of water while y'all are typing.
Imagine there's people like me getting off of work too.
Oh, for sure. All right, we've got Christina Gonzalez. Okay, Senior Community Engagement Planner with King County Metro. Excellent. It is a good thing we have buses around here. Makes not driving much easier, so I'm very glad they exist. And also light rail and all that. Okay, Rachel, my director is the parent of an autistic young adult. Ramona, another director at the ARC, is the parent of a ADHD young woman. And I see a few more people typing, so I'll just wait a second or two before we jump to the next slides. All right, Karen Coe is a volunteer with the Seattle Sensory Garden and interested in creating a more accessible garden. Excellent. I know a lot of autistic people who like gardening and plants and all that, so glad you're doing that. All right, cool. Well, thank you all so much for introducing yourselves so far. Oh, Lisa, yeah, I know Lisa, a autistic adult and has neurodivergence on all parts of her family. Dean is a dentist. Ooh, excellent. And would like to understand how you can manage autistic people in a positive manner. Yeah, we should definitely connect on that because that's a very unmet need in Seattle for sure. All right, excellent. Well, thank you all so much for being here. So y'all might have heard a couple of times we are from the Arc of King County. In case you haven't heard of us before, we are an agency that advocates for the rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including but not limited to autism. Essentially creating a world where we can live, learn, and play, and take for granted the same choices that non-disabled people are able to take for granted on a daily basis. We help people navigate the very confusing service system, which has been all the more confusing and chaotic the past month or two, and help people find things like stable housing if possible. We help people navigate the really confusing IEP process, special education and all of that. And we probably do a lot more in addition to that. So you can, if you're interested in receiving services, you can call the phone number listed on the screen or email us at ask@arcofkingcounty.org, and we're happy to assist as we can. All right, so we figured, since we're talking about autism and neurodiversity, we should probably start off by telling y'all what autism actually is. So autism is considered to be a neurodevelopmental disorder that's present since before someone's born, essentially created in utero, that primarily seems to exist through a combination of like 80-ish to 90% genetics and maybe like 10-ish% environmental factors. We're still not quite sure what the environmental factors are, other than we know for sure that it's not vaccines. Vaccines do not cause autism. Um, and the way autism is going to impact people is going to be different from person to person. So, you've got a widespread, like some folks might have an intellectual disability, some folks might be unable to speak. Other folks might be able to mask or hide the fact they're autistic from you, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell. But there are a few like core, traits that the vast majority of people, autistic people have. The first is sensory differences. Some of us have, much more sensitive hearing, or to like things like sound. We might be much more sensitive to like touch, taste, smell, and that can have a big impact in things like going to dentist's office, for example, or trying to endure school for 8 hours a day. A lot of autistic people will have meltdowns and shutdowns due to the just overwhelming just how because of how overwhelming the world can be. Some of us might have a strong need for like predictability, and when our expectations are not met, or unexpected surprises happen, like a unexpected phone call, for instance. It could be the meltdowns, shutdowns, or just a lot of anxiety. A lot of autistic people have co-occurring mental health conditions, unfortunately. A lot of us socialize differently, and a lot of that just comes down to like the brain differences that exist. So we're not going to be making eye contact. We're not going to be talking about like sports or the weather or whatever non-autistic people like talking about. Um, I'm not necessarily sure if this one is specific to autism, but we often have executive functioning disabilities as well, co-occurring, like ADHD is a very common one. Somewhere between like 30 to 70% of autistic people have ADHD as well. And executive functioning is the brain's ability to plan and organize tasks in a, in a organized and logical manner. And finally, unfortunately, autistic people encounter a lot of trauma out there in the world just from the way we're treated by non-autistic people, just from living in like really inaccessible, systems, places. And it just means we're going to be spending a lot more energy than, your average non-autistic person out there. And autism is, not the only form of neurodivergence out there. And Jonathan's going to tell us about some of the others.
Yeah, so I think neurodiversity is a term that's gaining a lot of traction, which I think is great. And but I'm sure people have questions about the neurodiverse framework, and I think that this is a great graphic that shows other um, neurotypes that would be a type of neurodiversity. And I think the best way to understand them is to understand uh, neurodiversity in contrast to neurotypicality, and that uh, essentially when most people are neurotypical, the structures of way that even just a room is set up, or how language is constructed, or expectations for like work performance, or like what we give credit to and what we discredit, all can lead to that marginalization of people that are neurodiverse, who can actually have a lot of strengths. So I do like this graphic because it has a lot of strengths of different ways that people that dyslexia can actually have really creative thinking and see things over a different lens. I know with my ADHD that I feel like I do have strengths in certain ways, but when we only see it through that deficit lens, uh, we're going to decide we might be defining everything as either neurotypical or not, as opposed to neurodiverse, which is there's different neurotypes, and they're only a deficit because we're measuring them by how they're not neurotypical, which is as opposed to just looking at different neurotypes. And this is a great example of how I think someone in the comments said that they had a brain injury, and that can lead to having now a sort of more neurodiverse neurotype. I've also had 3 concussions myself, and I know that that can lead to its own issues when accessing spaces, and that would be like that would be an example of a neurotype that's outside of what is normally talked about, which is autism and ADHD. So do you want to add anything?
I think I think you covered everything very well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Um, and it's one of these things where, not all autistic people, have other forms of neurodivergence, but most do. Oh, sorry. The screen jumped ahead. Not all autistic people, or all have other forms of neurodivergence, but like most of us do. Not all like neurodivergent people over here are autistic. Some might just have like ADHD or like other learning disabilities, et cetera, et cetera. And autistic essentially means like non-autistic. It's a term I only really heard used in the autism world. And then neurotypical is essentially someone who is not neurodivergent. So it's someone who just has a your average brain that does all of your average expected brain things in average and expected ways. Does this make sense? Do folks have any questions about any of this before we jump ahead? I'm assuming not, so we're gonna jump ahead then. Really quickly, Jonathan's gonna give us a really brief overview of language preferences.
Yeah, I've definitely heard people. Sometimes it's even people that haven't really disclosed being autistic around talk about, oh, it's better to say like person with autism. I think that yeah, in the autistic community, that autistic person is better, identity first, language is better. Uh, Mostly because sometimes that like detaching when we say like someone with autism leans more into that like medical model and that shaming model, that like they're trying to like take the autism out of the person, as opposed to it autism really colors every experience. It is it really defines that person. So when we talk about person with autism, it's really close to that sort of like ending autism, which it's kind of like, well, that's a little scary because we're really talking about really just kind of getting rid of autistic people. And so autistic person was better. I akin it to sometimes to like, it says ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. For example, like I'm bisexual. I don't think someone would say like person with well, they would, in the past. and try to remove that as opposed to one that's part of the person, right? So,
Right, or
oh,
like
yeah.
claim it's just a phase or something like that.
Right, exactly. And I think a lot of people can suffer from imposter syndrome when it comes to neurodiversity, so it could be harmful
True.
to shame that. So,
Excellent. Well, thank you. Let's see. Lisa says in chat that she loves the graphic. I didn't quite catch when she posted that, so I'm assuming she's talking about all the graphics, including this one. So, thank you, Lisa. And Rocio, let me know if I mispronounced that. Was late because they were driving. I mean, I guess not crashing your car is like a somewhat acceptable excuse to be late to a presentation. So we'll excuse it just this once. All right. So really quickly, we just want to talk about some of the different ways that autism and other disabilities have been sort of portrayed in the world and how we've been taught to view autism and disability. So most of the systems we operate under exist in a very sort of like medical model mode of disabilities where things like autism, neurodivergence is seen as very similar to things like cancer, COVID, diabetes, as you can see at this bus ad that went around from Seattle Children's Research Institute about 10 years or so ago that says, let's wipe out cancer, diabetes, and autism in his lifetime. Not necessarily, I mean, I'm fine with like wiping out, cancer and diabetes because like those could legit kill you. But like autism, like my autism hasn't tried to kill me yet, and I'm, generally okay with it. And, it's a reflection of just like how the medical system and the treatment providing system treats autism. Like if it can't be removed or cured, you're often taught to like hide your differences for the comfort of non-autistic people around you, no matter how much energy that takes you. And we now know from the research that, the more energy we as autistic people are spending like hiding our autistic traits, the more likely we are to have things like suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety. And it's a pretty big deal, unfortunately. The medical system, like it's not entirely bad. Like, there are definitely some disabilities that can cause people pain or harm. And like, sure, it's important for those to be like medicalized and cured and treated. But when it's something like autism or ADHD, it's a bit of a different circumstance, unfortunately. And they still try to, you know, cure us if they can. The social model of disability is, sort of like a way we'd like to view autism and disabilities. Instead of only seeing the disability as existing within the person, it sees disability as existing as an interplay between the person's body, mind, and the environment, both the physical and social expectations around them, and looks at, you know, how is this person impaired? How is this person impacted? Like, sure, if you can't walk on your legs, yeah, like that's a disability, that's an impairment. And also the fact that like, you use a wheelchair and like, there's no stair or ramps or elevators around you. That's a pretty big issue as well. And so disability doesn't only exist within the person. And it also means like there's an onus on like society to create a more accessible world for everyone, including people with disabilities and including autistic people. I have a lot more to say on this, but we're just skipping it because of time. As far as, okay, I realize I might be autistic. How do I get assessed or ADHD? It's really going to depend on the specific disability you have. With something like autism, if like it's a child being assessed, usually you bring it up with the child's pediatrician. They'll then usually refer you to an agency that's able to evaluate for autism or other like similar developmental disabilities. Unfortunately, right now though, waiting lists are very long. Rachel or Ramona, do y'all know like how long the waiting lists are at this point? Like I've heard of upwards of like 2 years in some cases in King County.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm hearing 2 years. And I'm hearing it's not only that, but trying to get to the top of a list. Like you fall off the list goes nowhere. It just seems almost impossible for a lot of families.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because it's often a very stressful time for the families. For adults, it's often just as stressful. A lot of medical insurances won't actually cover it. Autism evaluations, or they will, but you really have to know the right things to say, and that can be something that the ARC supports you with. But out of pocket, these tests are about $2,000 to $3,000, which is quite expensive. Something like 50 to 80% of autistic people are unemployed, whether or not they're officially diagnosed. And so that means, in order to get an assessment, you might have to pay that out of pocket, and a lot of us wouldn't be able to do that necessarily. A lot of autistic people are also on Medicaid, and as far as I can tell, there are currently no providers in Washington State who accept Medicaid and evaluate for autism in adults over 25. So this is a very big and significant issue, access and equity issue that is, having a very dire impact on autistic folks right now. And it's leading to circumstances where a lot of autistic people are like self-diagnosing. So, Jonathan, what does that mean?
So I mean, from my personal story, I can speak to, and this is something I've heard from a lot of people too. I had an ADHD diagnosis that was official, which was actually, I'm not saying easy, but definitely easier, a lot easier to access. And then, I started grad school, experienced a lot of burnout, and I was describing to my therapist some stuff, and then she was like, "Well, this could be definitely. This seems." My therapist is also ADHD, and she's like, "This seems familiar to this." And so I went to my mental health nurse practitioner, and uh, he did a probability quotient, which was like, oh, pretty high probability. But he also told me, he's like, it's really a lot of effort and not probably worth proceeding because you're going to get accommodations from ADHD anyways. It's expensive, and he couldn't do it because he's a nurse practitioner, so he would have to go to psychiatrist, and so there's a lot of barriers, and so a lot of people, lean towards self-diagnosis or self-regulation. And I also think that it's important too that I'm of the opinion of someone in the autistic community that if people are able to access the tools and treat, anything, research tools, treatment, conversations, or community, or even just online help, um, and benefit from it, then I think that then I'm gonna allow them to identify the way they want to identify, because I don't think there's anything wrong with having, more autistic people in the world, and or just getting help from the research that's been done, and the resources that are out there. I know that as a high school teacher, there's a lot of conversations like people are going on TikTok and they're just like, oh, self-diagnosing as autistic or faking it or whatever. And to me, I'm like, well, that kind of seems to me like comes from a place of like fear of anti-autism, that they're like they have such a big reaction to, possibility that some people might be discovering that they're autistic through social media. I'm like, well, if it helps them, it helps them. Why is that, why is that a big deal? So um that's kind of what I have to say around self-diagnosis, and why that might be something more popular, as people are disclosing more, or things are becoming more, this neurodiverse conversations becoming more popular.
Totally. Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where like, this isn't something people just do like overnight after seeing a single
Yeah, absolutely.
like screen of a TikTok video, that's typically most autistic people I know take, at least a couple of years to, go through this like self-diagnosis and like acceptance journey before they really fully start to accept that they're autistic. This is everything from like, research professors who research autism to just like people who don't necessarily like work within the autism world. So it's, but yeah, typically there's this process that happens, and it's not, and the vast majority of people I've run across, I think are like accurate in their self-diagnosis. I can maybe only think of like one or two people I've run into over the years out of probably like thousands at this point who self-diagnosed, who
Yeah,
were
and then
inaccurate.
I even, I still even get imposter syndrome sometimes. I'll talk to my therapist, and she was like, I've read like 6 or 7 books by now about neurodiversity and autism. She's like, well, I don't think a neurotypical person would read 6 books about autism and still wonder, well, maybe not. She's like, it's a pretty autistic thing to do. So
Yeah. No, my favorite is like whenever someone like has a spreadsheet about like all of the autistic traits they have, all of the ones
yes,
they
100%.
don't, very,
Yeah,
very well formatted. And I'm just like, okay, yeah, go to someone who evaluates, show them this spreadsheet, and that I strongly suspect that, that it will be a very quick assessment.
It'll be quick, yeah.
Yeah, it's my favorite thing. And another reason why a lot of people might self-diagnose is just because, like, even amongst professionals who work with autistic people, there's sometimes a lot of like understandings or misperceptions about what autism is actually. So over the past like 10 years I've been doing this work, I've just started collecting a list of all of the just most ridiculous, like, you can't be autistic because you do this or that. So everything from like, you can't be autistic because you have a psychology degree, ignoring the fact that like most people who get psychology degrees do so to better understand themselves, and like what kind of person might do that, like neurodivergent people. Everything from like, oh, your IQ is too high to be autistic, or your IQ is too low to be autistic. My all-time favorite, you don't actually look autistic, or can't be diagnosed with autism over the age of 8, said by someone in Kaiser Permanente. You make eye contact, or you dress normal, or you're just too good with perspective taking to be autistic, or, oh no, you're married and interested in romantic relationships, so that means you're not autistic, or you can't be autistic because you have friends. Curious if any of the other like autistic people in the audience have gotten some of these before. I mean, I always get the "you don't look autistic," but that's usually when I'm not wearing sassy shirts announcing the fact that I'm autistic.
I am not autistic, so I know that question was specifically sent out to autistic people, but I will say my son was denied an autism diagnosis for a long time because they said he made eye contact, so he couldn't possibly be autistic. I don't know if that was on your list, but
It is on the very right side, down 4.
down there somewhere. But
Yeah.
yeah, that was a common one we heard, and I still hear it today. I've also heard, you only can tell if they're autistic, or the best way to tell is because they're flapping their hands, kind of implying that all
Implying
autistic
autistic
people do
people are birds. That's what they're
are birds,
implying. Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where just like, yeah, there's so many just like ridiculous misperceptions out there about who we are and what we do. And like, sure, most autistic people don't make eye contact. The ones who do are like rare, maybe like 20%. Most autistic people hate loud noises. It's a similar percentage, around 80% to 20, who just love going to like heavy metal concerts and all that. I just, don't understand that type.
And I think too, like,
Mhm.
if I get, like, a lot of it's like their perception is like of autism is when people are like the most distressed
Mhm.
and
Yep.
not they don't see, so it's like if I'm having a really good day and it's like low sensory and it's predictable and I did my favorite things, then I might be more open to doing more stuff that is sensory wise, or sometimes I even notice I can make eye contact better, kind of like, it might be masking, but I'm more able to mask. I can hold it longer. But then they don't see, that like if we're having a really bad day, and then they go, oh, and then it's like, well, if you see me on that day, you might go, oh, you do look autistic. But it's like their definition of autism is just only just the distress, like like over sensory stuff like that.
Yeah, overstimulated. Yeah, I like to say we
Yeah.
don't actually know what autism looks like. We just know what very traumatized autistic people look like. It's lovely. And so we've said the word masking several times. I'm sure there's at least one person who's like, why are we talking about masks? Like, are we talking like, party masks, or like, the kinds of masks you'd see people wearing in like theaters or plays? So masking refers to the practice of hiding or camouflaging our autistic traits for the comfort of the non-autistic people around us. And it's a very double-edged sword. On the one hand, like, masking can be very useful when you're like interacting with like the police, for example, and don't want to get arrested for flapping your hands, or you're at a job interview and you want to get the job, and have to like, not flap your hands for a couple of minutes, or, appear to make eye contact, talk in a appropriate tone about things like the weather and sports. But we also know autistic people who are masking are spending a lot more energy in every single given like social interaction compared to non-autistic people. And we already know from the research that autistic people's brains at rest are spending about 40% more energy than non-autistic people. So masking is exhausting. Being autistic is exhausting on top of, the masking. And it unfortunately, you know, it's the biggest predictor of suicidal ideation in autistic adults. And it's also directly linked to something called autistic burnout, which is something, you know, a lot of autistic people have gone through. Jonathan, do you want to talk about autistic burnout?
Yeah, and I think this could also be a really helpful slide for those that are like trying to understand, uh, you know, autistic family members or individuals. I'm sure, you know, well, I'm 100% positive there any autistic people watching have experienced, you know, burnout. It's kind of hard not to because the expectations to even just I feel like survive in this world is going to lead to burnout, unfortunately. You know, so you got to come up with some really creative strategies, but basically prolonged periods of intense masking and stress seem to be the biggest factors. I listened to an audiobook where someone described it as like when expectations are greater than your capability and support system over time. And since we know that like expectations are often based off like neurotypical expectations, you know, uh, how I found out about autistic is I had a really severe period of burnout right in the middle of grad school. Uh, and I think that, you know, and I think honestly it started a lot earlier, you know, it's what probably led to ADHD, but then it kept getting worse and worse. But having those expectations continue and continue, whether it's like you've been masking for so long, you don't realize how it's exhausting, and then you're trying to maintain all these other things that we do in the world, and then it just starts to hit you. And I think that one thing is like the mental, physical, and emotional exhaustion is, or at least for me, it's like I think it's very different than you know maybe neurotypical like I'm tired, you know, and it's going to look the recovery is going to look different too. Often it means not returning to whatever demand level of demands you were holding for yourself before, you know, and making some big changes. And it's not, you know, okay, I just need to like take more naps or stretch or whatever. It's usually when you have autistic burnout, you got to kind of rethink a lot of stuff because that physical mental exhaustion could be like catatonia, you know, like not moving um, for long. I thought for me, I think I felt like I was definitely depressed, but I learned that depression was more the symptom of the autistic burnout. It was kind of like it looked like depression, but it was more just like real medically exhausted, you know. Um, but I think also now as the demands are coming, you know, increasingly difficult and you know, kind of harsh. I feel like we're definitely seeing. I see bigger conversation around autistic burnout, especially the last couple of years. I don't know if you want to add anything, Zach, or
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that I think the vast majority of autistic people go through, especially, you know, young adulthood or like the transition from, you know, teenage years to young adulthood, once a lot of the supports you have sort of start to drop away. Yeah, it's exhausting. And it's also, I think, the reason like why, you know, there's very like high suicidality in autistic young adults at that point, very connected to autistic burnout.
Mhm.
And very connected to executive dysfunction as well. And yeah, like Jonathan said, it's something we're still, you know, still being researched, but I'm very glad to see more awareness and conversation about it. Like, you know, when I first started doing this presentation, like 7, 8 years ago, no one heard of it. Even those who work with autistic people now, most have heard of it. So, you know, there's hope, but it's still going to be another like 20 years before I think we're really going to
right.
be able to like work with it and treat it properly. Do folks have any questions or comments about anything we've said so far? I saw Lisa said that she's gotten backhanded compliments like, "Oh, look what you accomplished considering you're autistic." Like, yeah, that does feel a little patronizing. Like, were they talking about, "Oh, you made eye contact. Wow, so accomplished. Much wow." Or was it, yeah, I'm curious.
Well, I have a very busy, demanding life, and I set really high bars for myself. I don't really factor in the autism. So when I share what I do with my life, I graduated summa cum laude in June with my master's of science in psychology, and I got a lot of that. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how I do it either, but I don't know how you do it considering you're autistic. That just doesn't factor in for me.
Yeah, that does feel kind of patronizing for sure. Um, yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, but yeah, people will always say interesting things for sure.
Next time someone that you know is neuro or whoever said that if they're neurotypical and they do something that would be impressive. Just like, I don't know how you do it being neurotypical. Like, how did you?
Yeah. It's got to be so hard, like not liking trains or like flapping your hands or, knowing how to line up things properly. That's got to be really
Yeah.
difficult. I don't know how you get through the day like that.
Not having
Um,
any good special deep interest in anything.
oh God, the poor things.
Yeah.
So we know from the research, unfortunately, the suicide rate in the autism world's about 9 times greater than the general population, according to 20 different studies out there now. Similarly, the rates of sexual assault are very high. 31% of autistic people have been sexually assaulted or raped at least once in their lifetime. That's about twice as much as the general population. The studies are like conflicting as to like whether or not autistic people are more likely to engage in substance abuse. It seems to be like 50-50 in terms of like the research. Some say we are, some say we aren't. And I think the biggest sort of like deciding factor is like co-occurring ADHD. That, I that typically does mean you're going to be more likely to engage in substance use. But there's with all the stuff we're going through, there's not nearly as much of it as as I would expect, which is nice. We are much more likely to have encountered homelessness compared to the general population, just because of the like high unemployment rate. Just because of the like autistic burnout or high demands on executive functioning. And the research shows that autistic people are estimated to die 16 to 30 years earlier on average compared to non-autistic people. That's not necessarily because of autism itself, in most cases. That's usually just because the medical care we receive is typically not as good as it would be for non-autistic people. It comes down to like provider communication, knowing how autistic people experience pain differently, knowing how to ask questions the right way. It's very similar for folks with ADHD as well. I think there was a study that came out, you know, last month that said, people with ADHD were about 10 years, died 10 years earlier on average compared to the general population. Finally, the people most at risk of dying early are autistic people with epilepsy. Their life expectancy on average in this one study was estimated to be about 36. So there's a lot of really depressing statistics out there, and a lot of it just comes down to like the societal factors that really have a negative impact on us. As far as like what kind of services exist for autistic people, autistic adults specifically in Washington state, there's honestly not too much. If you're lucky enough to be, well, I shouldn't say lucky enough, but if you are eligible for developmental disability administration services, you can get things like, residential, services, your housing being covered, having support staff, support you throughout the day if you need it. You can have support with like vocational work. You can get supportive employment, and there's probably a lot of other services you can get on top of those that I'm forgetting. But only about 20% of autistic people, when I wrote this, qualified for DDA. DDA based on the criteria that existed. At this point, they have removed the intellectual disability like requirement to also to, be approved for DDA services as an autistic person. So that's potentially going to impact the numbers, but I think it's still too early to really see what the impact's been so far. There's a couple of other organizations out there that do provide services to autistic people, specifically like the Alyssa Burnett Center. They have classes and some day programs. The Square Pigs is a series of like online and in-person beat up social and like support groups that I run. And then pretty much like autistic people usually just got to rely on like, things like the community mental health system, which usually doesn't receive very much training on autism or developmental disabilities. As children, typically they can be eligible for things like early intervention system if they're diagnosed early enough. And that can get things like speech therapy or occupational therapy, can provide training and support to parents. But right now, like Washington State, very much underfund services for mental health and people with developmental disabilities. I think we're, and Ramona, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, we're like, what is it, 37th out of 50th per capita in terms of developmental disability funding in the country.
We are 39th, and that's for specifically community support as opposed to institutionalization. We tend to put more money historically into institutions, even though we don't have very many left. We've put a lot more money into institutions, unfortunately, than community support.
Yeah, it's something that's had a very, I would say, deadly impact on us, unfortunately. And so it just speaks to the need for advocacy here for sure. Awesome. And we also know, your experience with autism is going to be directly impacted by some of the other social identities you have. Um, there's a lot, intersectionality plays a big part in autism. And we're going to today talk a little about, the connection between autism and, membership with the LGBTQIA plus community. And I believe Jonathan, as the representative here of the autistic LGBTQIA plus community, has a few thoughts, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just a few. But I do think it's interesting that and I don't know if this was this is a survey research you
That
did,
I
but
did
that's
back
also
in
been
2019. Yeah.
oh, right on. Yeah, and it's been substantiated out and also in a lot of like online communities that there's a higher there's definitely a higher LGBTQIA representation in the autistic community. I don't know if there's been like psychological research about it, but I think that it has to do with sort of like having a brain that doesn't automatically like intuitively fall into norms and gender norms, sexuality norms. So I think that possibly having a bottom up processing brain opens up to, a different conception of like sexuality outside of like strictly heteronormative. So I do think there is a higher representation. So I think that if you're going to talk about supporting the autistic community, autistic people, you have to also be talking about how to support LGBTQI community. And the intersection of that for me would be like, if you want to support both, it might be rethinking sometimes like accessibility to some LGBTQI spaces in terms of, whether it's like sensory needs or just like the conversations they're having, and if, making sure that they're also anti-ableist at the same time, which doesn't always happen in my experience. And moving on to this one, yeah, so also, sorry, I'm just reading quick because it's been a while. Yeah, and there's also, unfortunately, when you have any intersection connected to marginalization, there's going to be worse mental health outcomes because my personal experience, you're masking kind of on multiple fronts, and there's a lot of similarity to the way that those masks work, and trying to find spaces that are safe in both ways, not just one or the other. And I think sometimes in LGBTQI spaces too, especially recently, unfortunately, there's some like anti-transness too. So you know, I'm not trans, but I'll definitely take this opportunity to say supporting and being very open about trans rights and is an important time right now to do so, so that like queer spaces are safe for like everybody.
Yeah, it's one of those things where like, the existence of autism is being used to diminish the, personhood and autonomy of, teenagers, who wish to transition.
Hmm.
There are, as back a year or two ago, there were several bills in various different state houses requiring, people who wanted to gender transition get assessed for autism. And if they were assessed positive for autism, then they wouldn't be allowed to transition because, apparently as autistic
Oh
people,
wow,
we can't understand our own genders or our own things like sexuality or, whether or not we're experiencing gender dysphoria, right? Like,
I didn't know if that was being weaponized like that. That's wild.
oh yeah,
Mm.
it's been a really fun year. Um, and, similar to what Jonathan was adding, a recent study in terms of looking at like what are the experiences of autistic people in like receiving gender affirming care. This one specific study was in the UK, so it's hard to know if this is can be generalized to the US. I would suspect it's going to be worse in the US because there's no standardized system in the US like there is in the UK. But what it showed was like things like the lack of provider education, the significant sort of like economic barriers that autistic people encounter, um, and just like the lack. It's essentially like, you know, providers who are competent working with like queer folks are not competent necessarily in working with autistic folks, and vice versa. So really, to provide good services to autistic people, you gotta, really understand all the intersections. Um, you know, we also know from research now that there are in fact autistic women out there, and who better to talk about it than two autistic men, right? We'll do our best, but there's always much more diversity and experience up here. So yeah, take it away, Jonathan.
Yeah, and I do think the model, the original model, if you want a great book, Neurotribes, goes through the history of like neurodiversity and stuff. But still, even to recent medical like history, it was focused on like young white boys, as represented here. And that definitely creates, a lot of misdiagnosis for women that uh I know, my wife is on actually kind of like going through like finding out ADHD, and which I think is actually not a coincidence. I learned a cool term called clustering, where even people don't realize they're neurodiverse. They tend to like, cluster because you find someone whose brain works like yours, and you can connect. That being said, I think it was a lot long. It's been a long process for her too, because it's been like they want to say like anxiety, and they want to say depression, and they want to say anxiety again, probably 4 more times. And that's just because a lot of practitioners just don't see it as something that could exist in women. It's seen as a male thing, uh, and also the way that women are socialized, in a typical way, if we're thinking like typical stereotypical raising, are often actually given a lot more scripts on how to like make other people feel comfortable and appease and all that. And so their mask can sort of almost mask in a way that's just as harmful in terms of masking, but almost like skirt, getting an autistic diagnosis. And it can also appear differently. And so if practitioners aren't trained on how it can, present differently, that can also lead to women being missed.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. And yeah, like so often, like most autistic women I know have been previously diagnosed with things like ADHD, bipolar disorder, in some cases borderline personality disorder. We know like ADHD and depression is a common co-occurrence for autism. But borderline personality disorder may be a little more common, but not nearly at the rate of it is right now officially. There's also like when we know women are so much more likely to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder than men. And I think like misdiagnoses of autism may be one of the reasons why. But typically what happens is like, autistic women usually are better able to like mask than your average autistic boy at the same age, or autistic girls better able to mask than autistic boys at the same age. And that means, yeah, like Jonathan said, providers are going to miss that. They're going to, autistic girls are much more likely to sort of like internalize their struggles. And so you're not going to see as much like meltdowns that you might see in autistic boys. And that's another reason why so many get missed. Typically, like, they're able to meet the social demands until like middle school. And that's really when the mask starts to crack and you start seeing a lot more issues that autistic girls run into. And that's typically when they start getting diagnoses like ADHD or like depression, anxiety, and they might have those as well. Um, Ramona said in chat, the masking and misdiagnosis can lead to PTSD, which makes it yeah, more difficult to land on a diagnosis. Yeah, like I totally know who you're talking about there. And like, yeah, that's very common, unfortunately, for a lot of autistic women. We also know from the research that the things accessibility of like diagnoses for BIPOC autistic folks is often quite difficult. It's been getting better over the years, but I know like my experience as a white autistic dude is going to be a lot different than a black autistic woman. And you know, there's just like a lot of research on disparities. But well, no, actually, there isn't nearly enough research on disparities. But what we do know is things like, developmental milestones are going to be different from culture to culture, and that was like hampering accessible evaluations for BIPOC folks and especially like immigrants. Um, but when it comes to like research on like disparities for like BIPOC autistic adults, there's hardly anything at all. Like I seriously think there's still more studies on like how broccoli impacts autistic people's social skills than there are on like disparities BIPOC autistic adults encounter. And I'm honestly not exaggerating on this. There are a lot of studies on broccoli, scarily. I don't know why, but there is. And so it's one of these things where studies are being created and being generalized, even though the audience is the subjects are primarily white, very little BIPOC representation. And the similar thing also happens with studies on when it comes to gender as well. Like there's often a lot of like autistic boys like overrepresented, and then that, the research and results are then generalized to all of the autistic people. And then we also know like BIPOC autistic folks, are much more likely to encounter things like their autistic symptoms being seen as threatening, which often then gets the police called on them, which then can lead to deadly interactions. There have been a couple of circumstances that I know about where like, an autistic person was just, a like BIPOC autistic person was just walking down the street, flapping their hands. The one I'm specifically thinking of in Chicago, couldn't respond verbally and didn't turn and look at the police, and so was just walking away from them, and then was unfortunately shot by the police. That happens, unfortunately, quite frequently. So, when we talk about things like masking, it's a much deadlier, sort of calculation that BIPOC autistic people need to, experience. And I wish as a white dude, like I can only talk about this so much. I don't necessarily have the personal insight. And this is always an area that needs more research and needs presentations of its own on. Lisa wrote in chat that part of my capstone project focused on how as autism shows in females and why/how autism is so easily missed in females and repercussions on female mental health quality of life / lack of needed supports for the misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. If you ever want an autistic female voice to help uh, present about this in the future, I'm here. Yeah, Lisa, now that I know you're out of grad school, like I'll definitely be reaching out to you more about presentations like this. Would love to have you in the future again. All right, so we've talked about a lot of the sort of like large societal level factors that impact our experiences as autistic people. And now we get to dive a little just deeper into, like how do we make things specifically better for autistic people? How can we modify things? So I did a little research on this a couple of months ago, and I found something called Autism Space from Autistic Doctors International. It's a great, just a really great like research article talking about, yeah, how do we make the system more accessible for autistic people? As it stands, I believe this study was I think this one was from the UK, talking about the experiences of autistic people receiving services in the medical care system. And you see things like, fear, anxiety, shame, guilt, frustration, can stop us from, putting ourselves in the process of trying to get medical care. This is something that has a big impact on like autistic femmes who might have, autoimmune conditions. That's very common. And it can be hard to get doctors to believe you, let alone when you're neurodivergent. We see executive functioning is also a significant challenge for autistic people when trying to get and receive care. Oftentimes we know miscommunications happen. Waiting rooms are really loud. Medical care is expensive considering that like 50% of us are unemployed and, a lot of us are relying on like Medicaid, and who knows if Medicaid's even going to be around, next week at this point. So there's a lot of fear that people are experiencing right now around all of this. Um, I also did a survey about like physical health conditions that the 140, I think 141 autistic people who took this survey had. And not surprisingly, sleep and circadian rhythm disorders were very common. About 50% had them. I would suspect that number is higher in autistic children. But then you see things like, migraines, very common, asthma, hormone imbalances, very common. So it's just, yeah, there's a lot of co-occurring disabilities. And then, research says that about maybe like 30% of autistic people have intellectual disabilities. I think that number is probably a little closer to like 20%, just because, like, we know a lot of autistic people with lower support needs are getting missed. ADHD 30 to 70% based on the study. OCD very common, learning disabilities common, anxiety about 80% of people in this survey reported having anxiety, not surprising, unfortunately. Depression, 2/3, things like PTSD, about 40%. I suspect that number is much closer to like 100%, honestly. A lot of us are traumatized. So there's a lot going on when it's autism. It's usually not just autism. You can't miss the forest. You can't miss the forest for just the autism tree, essentially, which so often happens. And so in terms of thinking about, yeah, how do we create better, more supportive systems? I mentioned Autistic Space. Um, it's a study from Autistic Doctors International. Like, look it up if you have a chance. They're great. And so they basically, say like you have, in terms of like considering good quality of care, you have to first divide things into the, physical category, the processing category, and the emotional category for in terms of like how we experience receiving care. And then you have to look at factors like our sensory systems, the sensory system of the, place around us. You have to look at like how predictable is the process of receiving care, how much executive functioning do we have to spend to receive care? Because oftentimes at the end of the day, like that's all spent from working or just trying to get the bills paid, trying to get groceries, and all that, or making food. Then there's acceptance. Like a lot of us will experience, doubt, blame, or shame from the providers who just don't understand like why we need 3 or 4 reminders to fill out a simple form or respond to a single email. That goes directly to the communication as well, realizing autistic people tend to be a little more direct or blunt in our communications and interactions. And that just leads to the need for empathy for autistic people as well, receiving care. And so, yeah, I basically said all of this already, but we also know from the research, like implicit bias has a very big impact on autistic people. Autistic people are much more likely to be judged more negatively for the things we do or just how we interact, whether or not other people around us know we're autistic or not. If they do know we're autistic, they're a little more likely to give us some grace, but there's still a noticeable impact, unfortunately. Jonathan, did you want to add anything to this?
Um, I mean, I was just thinking, like, since we have a dentist, like in the chats, uh, I'll just share my own personal experience that, I mean, I didn't go to the dentist probably for like 10 years. And then I went, I think last year, and it'll probably be like quite a while again. It's just the most overstimulating, difficult experience. And then the dentist came in later after the hygienist talked really fast. I didn't understand what I was supposed to do again, like following up. And then I was just like, all right, I'm good. And so I think that there's a lot, and we'll talk more about what we can do and how you can transfer over. I just say I can ensure that you already have autistic patients, whether you know it or not. I know they don't know that I am. There's no like, form or anything like that. And so it's more about creating the situation where it's like destimulating for everybody, and then that way, if there's an autistic patient, they feel comfortable. And I'm sure there's a lot to do. I know there's the inevitable medical practice that you can't avoid, uh, but I'm sure when we talk about other stuff, like we can relate it back to those spaces. But I'm super happy that the dentist is here because the dentist is like definitely probably shared common experience of people that are autistic that don't want to go to the dentist. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? I'm the dentist.
We
oh,
can,
right
yeah.
on. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for including me. Yeah, I'm finding this extremely valuable. And what I'm learning here is making sure I understand the triggers that could possibly keep a patient from seeking dental care. And I think I'm going to have to step back and when I know a patient includes autism in their medical history, I think it's important to really understand what makes them uncomfortable and what will make them comfortable in the dental office, and really understand that before proceeding.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's going to be very valuable. Anyone that rushes through and not understand the patient's triggers, so to speak, I think will be at a disadvantage, if that makes sense. I don't think it'll be a successful encounter.
Yeah. And I think that like I also might just mention that you might have someone that doesn't actually have on their medical history, like myself. And I know as a teacher, what I do is, I know I have autistic students that haven't been diagnosed, and I have students that have. So I just give an accommodation on assignments to all my students.
Correct.
That way, and so figuring out what those systems are that you can do for all your patients so that, when there's someone that's autistic, whether they are or not, they're going to get those accommodations. And I can ensure that, if you're that dentist doing that work and making someone feel comfortable, then you're going to be that person's dentist for life. Like when I have
Right.
that provider I feel comfortable with, I'm like, that's
Right.
the person forever now. Cause, once you find that one person don't work, it's kind of rare. And you're like, all right, I'm going there forever now. So,
Right.
yeah.
A lot of patients do better at different times of the day. Is there a better time in your experience treating a patient with autism? Is morning better, or it doesn't matter?
It's gonna depend. I would guess if there is a preference, it's usually gonna be a little later in the day, just
Later.
because of the co-occurring sleep disorders a lot of us have. But it's gonna depend from person to person. But yeah, great question for sure.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah. What about, can you touch upon medication at all? I assume that
I
some
wish.
autistic patients, is it too broad of a subject?
No, it's like there are literally more studies on how broccoli impacts our social skills than there are on just like our experiences with like side effects of medications. It's very poorly understood. And you also have to consider like a lot of autistic people will have like co-occurring anxiety disorders. So like when I got my wisdom teeth removed this year, like I was actually still conscious for about half of the procedure. And I talked to an autistic anesthesiologist I know, and she said like from the like anesthesiology research, it's either going to be like heavy drug users, opioid users, or people with
Sure.
high degrees of anxiety who, you know, uh, have that happen to them when under anesthesia.
Yeah.
But anecdotally, typically autistic people are going to be much more sensitive, especially like autistic women are going to be much more sensitive to like side effects as well. So
Sure.
that's something to be taken under consideration. From there, like the research just like isn't there at this point, and it's very frustrating, and it's an
Okay.
area that needs more research.
Right, right. As in general, and really I'm a novice at this, but do most autistic patients, are they on medication, the majority, or not? Or
I mean, I would guess so.
is it 50% or 40%, or do you have any idea?
Probably, I mean, I would guess it's higher than the general population, just considering things like we're going to have depression, anxiety
Sure.
going on. So I would guess higher, but I don't actually know of any studies that have looked at this. But that's an interesting question for sure.
Well, the reason is a lot of people don't admit certain things on their medical history. Sometimes you
Or
don't
we might
know.
forget. Yeah.
They forget, they don't remember, they don't want to share it. And I just was wondering.
And yeah, that's good. I'm going to ask one of my autistic psychiatrist friends if they know.
Well, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Can I
Appreciate it.
chime in here real quick?
Yeah, take it away, Lisa.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I am a 51-year-old female who hates going to the dentist.
Oh,
I,
no. Oh,
I
no.
went a couple of decades without going to the dentist, and a few years ago, I had to have a root canal. I don't like things in my mouth. I don't like the smell of the dentist office. I don't
Correct.
like how the chair feels underneath me. I don't like the bib on me. I don't like people's eyes on me. I don't like the lights in my face. I don't like any part of it. So,
That,
the one thing I wanted to say before I continue with that is I think the hardest part for people with professions like yours is that you just have to understand that every person is different. You can't really categorize everyone together. There's no generalizing anything. You might find statistically that certain people group together in certain areas, but
right.
everybody is going to have different wants and needs. In terms of time of day, I'm a morning person. I know a lot of autistic people who are definitely not morning people, but it's also going to depend on where I am in my life, how I feel mental health wise, how good my sleep is, how good I can psych myself up for this. I hate things in my mouth so much, and I hate my mouth being numb so much that I went for intubation. I wanted to be
Sure.
completely knocked out. And that took a few $1,000s right out of my pocket. But
Right.
it's either that or, my teeth rot. And then I have even worse health all
Sure.
around.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
yeah, just treat everyone as an individual and get to
I
know
agree.
them as an individual.
Right. I think that's where communication comes in. You really have to build a very positive patient relationship and build some trust so people will confide in you what their likes and dislikes are. So it can be a successful
Yeah.
treatment.
That's the
And I
big
think,
thing.
oh, yeah.
That's the big thing that is so incredibly hard to come by. It's
Yeah,
trust, and
it's
it's
trust.
also consistency with that relationship.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, you have to be very, very honest and very open.
Yeah, I totally, and I think that what like I can get through something distressing, difficult. I know that there's stuff you can't avoid, right? At the dentist, right? But there's sometimes some small things that would help so much. For example, like like you get an intake form that maybe doesn't say, "Oh, are you autistic or not," but that use other language that you can give to all your patients. Like, do you have sensory needs or sensory preferences? And then most people would feel comfortable disclosing that.
That's true.
Uh, and then an agenda of what are we doing today? We're going to do this and this and this, and then, oh, you have some
That's a good one.
cavities. Here's a written form. You need to call, well, probably not call, but you need to go follow up with this. And I love doctors and PT or whatever that have online scheduling for appointments as opposed to calling. If it's a call, I'm probably not gonna do it, to be honest. But if it's a portal where I can pick a time and schedule it online and then, write a
Sure.
message for it, then that helps a lot too. But those are just a few ideas, just like, I would think that when I'm in a space like that, I'm like, oh, I feel way better. I can schedule online. They have a form. They tell me what we're going to do. And then they give me a piece of paper that helps me remember what I have to do after.
Right, right. Well, thank you. That's really good
Yeah.
feedback. Appreciate that. Thank
For
you.
sure. Yeah, thanks for asking those questions. It's so good to know people do care. All right, so we're going to jump ahead to talk about the sensory differences really quickly since we have about 13 minutes left. So, Jonathan, take it away.
All right, I'll go. Yeah, I'll try to go quick. I think that sensory differences, to summarize some of this, is having a hyper connected brain, and it you can't really control when it's so hyper connected to things. And that one thing I've noticed that I read in a book too that really vindicated me was that if there's a bad smell or texture or taste, I didn't realize that if someone's allistic, that eventually they can kind of get used to it in a room, and that they'll be like, "Oh, you can get used to the smell and it goes away." If you're autistic, it's just going to get worse the longer you're around that smell. So it's just you can't just be like get used to a smell. That's something I've never been able to do. I didn't know it was a thing. What a superpower an holistic person has that they can just get used to a terrible smell in a room. So knowing that, if you want to get the most out, if you want to help a student of mine or someone in your family or something, controlling stimuli is, I think, like paramount. It's like number one thing. Visual clutter is a thing. Uh, and there's some really interesting stuff out there, like interoception and pain. Autistic people can struggle with actually knowing what they're feeling. I am somebody that I have very large tattoos, and when I've gotten them, I've taken naps. I have no problem getting a big tattoo. If there is like a tag on my shirt, it's worse than getting a tattoo. So I don't know how to explain that, but a small something bugging me on the back of my neck, it literally feels worse than getting a big tattoo that's a lot of pain. So uh, I'm more of a sensory avoider when I like this. My wife's definitely a sensory seeker. So just, it could be people can have differences, but I would definitely say overall though, making sure a space is like if you want it to work for them, like it can be really hard. I can tell though when I have coworkers that aren't neurodivergent, they just don't see the same thing. Uh, so, but if you can talk to an autistic person if you're in a space, I'm sure they can make that space really accommodating really fast. So they'll be able to point out right away what's causing. Because once that sensory overwhelm starts, it's really hard to focus or do anything else. Do you want to add anything else? Ed?
Yeah, I think what I'll add is, very similar to what Jonathan has just said. That we have to spend so much energy just balancing our sensory needs and existing in inaccessible spaces. So for me, like the sensory system and our experiences with that are directly connected to things like meltdowns, shutdowns, executive functioning, just because of how sensitive our brains can sometimes be attuned to the environment around us. And this can also lead to like really intense like startle reflexes, for instance, at things like dentist's office or doctor's offices during exams or other circumstances. And so, as far as like sensory accommodations, the research recommended turning off or down artificial lights, removing flickering or oscillating environmental features, avoiding a highly stimulating decor, and promoting the use of sunglasses, as Jonathan is taking the lead here on. And then also considering like how can you minimize, environmental noises or auditory clutter, avoiding conversations in like noisy environments, in the middle of procedures. That's usually helpful because a lot of autistic people have co-occurring auditory processing disorder. And that means it's not just like how loud a sound is, but like how many different sounds are going on at the same time at different like rates or pitches. Like that for me, like that right there is what shuts down my brain and prevents me from processing anything else. Also, a lot of autistic people are very sensitive to things like perfumes or other sort of like environmental scents. So avoiding things like aerosols or chemical air fresheners can be useful, or highly scented cleaning products. So ventilation is great with that. Um, and yeah, there's a lot more to say about that. But we also know autistic people can be much more sensitive to touch. Some are not, as Jonathan was talking about a little earlier. Proprioception, the ability to which is essentially the ability to sort of understand where our body is in the physical space around us. Like that can be impacted in autistic people, as well as interoception, which is the ability to identify our internal bodily sensations or with things like pain, or being hungry or stuff like that. And so that can have a big impact when receiving medical care because we might not be as attuned to our bodies just because, going back to the sensory system, we're often in very high rates of like sensory distress. And, when we're masking, we're just taught to ignore the signs of our distress in our body. And then that can lead to significant complications later on with things like cancer or like broken legs, for instance. We talked about this a lot. So social differences. Yeah, autistic people, just because of the way our brain is set up, means we're gonna want to socialize in a different way. For instance, we don't get the same sort of like dopamine rush as non-autistic people get when they're around their favorite people. Like we only get it when we're talking about like our favorite thing. Could be autism, could be how like Shrek and Han Solo dress exactly the same, or video games, or many other things, I'm sure. It also, autistic people will also have like co-occurring, as I mentioned, auditory processing disorders. And that can also directly impact like how much time it takes for us to hear something, formulate a response. Well, first, like, you know, change the like sort of like brain input from sound into like recognizable data for the brain, and then doing the whole process over again when you're trying to figure out like how to talk. There are also autistic people who really struggle with understanding nonverbal communication with others. So things like being able to tell someone's distressed just by looking at them, or angry or sad based on how their faces are. Um, we're also, a lot of us are much more like concrete thinkers. So things like sarcasm can be difficult for some of us to pick up. Um, and it can be all the more difficult when, we're in like negative sensory environments as well. And also like for autistic folks who also have like co-occurring intellectual disabilities, you know, the additional time needed to like process words is often much more significant as well. And for a lot of us, it just leads to sort of like a need for like predictability, sameness, knowing what to expect. And so that leads to a lot of us just like having the same routines, just because we're saving so much energy um, in dealing with, so we don't have to deal with as much like unpredictable stuff, for sure. So as far as like provider recommendations, just try and remove as much ambiguous communication as possible. Avoid requiring phone calls if possible. Have a way to send emails or submit forms online. That's great. Some autistic people, for instance, might not be able to speak with their mouth parts, and so for them, like they really need emails if they don't have good, like reliable care providers around them. And also understanding like the way we express empathy towards other people can be different, and the way we notice empathy that is sent to us by other people is also going to be different. So just trying to understand that for sure. Meltdowns and shutdowns. So really quickly, just the fact that, when we're in such like unpredictable, noisy, chaotic environments, or we're blamed for stuff that really wasn't our fault, or out of our control, or just like the fact that the world is just so unpredictable means, oftentimes our brain's ability to like cope with that stress and unpredictableness means, essentially there comes a point where like the lizard part in our brain takes over, and we're less able to our the higher order part of our brain that controls like thinking, or planning, or like cognitive processes essentially shuts down. And in that point, we just got to do what we got to do to make ourselves feel safe. So that could be like yelling, throwing things, running away. It happens when we feel like our safety is threatened and we don't know what to do about it. And so it's like the same part of our brain that controls if we're being chased by like lions or hyenas takes over essentially. um the way it looks in person is going to be different from person to person. I used to have a lot more meltdowns as a kid. Haven't really had one like maybe 8, 9 years as an adult. But it's just like what happens is like your ability to like cope with the stress just gets overwhelmed, and you start to get more and more agitated, and it becomes like harder and harder for you to think. And with most of us, there's like a point of no return to where like once we hit that, we're just not going to be able to stop it. And so in terms of thinking about like how do you help an autistic person during a meltdown, like if you can stop a meltdown sorry, from happening in the first place, that's what you got to do. It's not always possible, so figuring out ways to crowd control can be useful. Giving the person having a meltdown space is really useful. Trying to avoid like touch is useful. Sometimes touch can really trigger the meltdowns. Yeah, so it really depends on person to person, unfortunately. Oftentimes after the meltdowns happen, we're extremely stressed out, overwhelmed, and we're still not at 100%. So, maybe give us a little time to process what happened and talk about it later on. Oftentimes, a lot of us don't necessarily actually remember what happens during meltdowns. We might black out in some cases. And also, sometimes we do harm to other people. And it's like different from like, for instance, a tantrum where, tantrums are usually intentional. They're done for a specific reason, wanting a specific thing to happen. with meltdowns, like it's usually just because we don't feel safe and we don't know what to do about it. So our brain takes over to make ourselves feel safe. Shutdowns also happen to autistic people. They're basically just like where your brain's ability to process the sensory environment or just all the stimulus around you shuts down, and you can essentially appear as like catatonic or like, just being defiant and not responding to people around you. It's essentially a similar like process as a meltdown, where the meltdown will be like fight or flight. A shutdown is like a freeze reaction essentially for us. As far as like what do you do after a shutdown, it's basically the same as a meltdown. Give a person a chance to rest and process. If a lot of shutdowns are happening like over a sustained period of time, then that could be a sign that autistic burnout is approaching. So definitely be aware of that. And finally, at the very last minute, we just wanted to talk about executive functioning. So Jonathan, do you want to add anything about executive functioning?
Yeah, executive function is debate is essentially like what is required, and you have a task and working backwards on how to like work forward towards that task. I've done some reading, and I don't know, Zach, you could talk to this too, like adaptive functioning, like the stuff required to do day to day decisions and stuff. But I don't know, but it's similar. I have ADHD, which focuses on executive dysfunction, which is kind of like the inability to point yourself in the right direction to do the thing you want to do, even though you want to do it. And I've had those moments, but I think in terms of like, put my brain power towards executive function, where I study, struggle when I'm like, it's more about being autistic. Is more. I feel like when I have to think about doing something, I have to think about all the things that go into like every detail, even if I've done it before. So for some reason, like if I'm unloading dishes from the dishwasher, I'm thinking about like each place where it needs to go, and then maybe even if it should go there, and if I should reorganize the thing. And so it can take a lot of mental energy, or what we might say spoons. So one way to help with like removing that sort of mental burden and stuff is that's why routines can be so important, because that predictability of if this thing is going to happen, and how it's going to happen, then that way you're not like using all that brain power to think through all the specific tasks, which can lead to essentially not doing those tasks. And that's where you have sometimes even a shutdown, just if it's too many new tasks at once. Yeah, does that cover?
I think it does. Yeah. So we are at 5:31. So I just wanted to thank you all for listening to Jonathan and I ramble and sing the song of our people for the last hour and a half. So thank you all so much for being here. If you've got any last minute questions, please let us know. But also, like, I know you all got probably your own things to do as well. So if you need to leave now, we won't be too offended.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.